Hello everyone, I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I'm kicking off my Road to Ulysses series, in which I'm reading as much James Joyce as possible before I eventually get into the book Ulysses itself, hopefully within the next few months. And today, as the title will demonstrate, I am talking about A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This is actually my first James Joyce work I've ever read fully. I've read some Dubliners short stories a while ago, but even then I was in high school at the time, so I really have no confidence that I actually did read it or not. So this is going into James Joyce blind. I didn't want to read Ulysses first, so I think I made a good choice with starting with some of his more accessible works before I get into that. For those of you who don't know, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was written by James Joyce and was published in 1916 while he was away from Ireland. He had tried to get various forms of this novel published before, once as called just A Portrait of the Artist, and then once as Stephen Hero, which was like 800 something manuscript pages when he tried to get it published. But eventually, this version of the book was eventually what hit print. And with this video, I'm focusing more on the themes that is covered in this book. I'm not focusing on the plot so much, but as a general synopsis, it follows Stephen Dedalus from his early years in elementary school or primary school up until his time studying in Dublin at the University College Dublin. And it focuses on him interacting with the Ireland at the time, which is very tumultuous, both with Protestant Catholic conflicts and conflicts between Ireland and Great Britain, which Great Britain still had control over at the time. So it's a very politically and religiously tumultuous period of Ireland, and you can see that here in the works itself. And it follows Dedalus as he eventually comes to terms with the fact that Ireland, as a culture, is restricting him both from his artistic pursuits, and decides to leave. Stephen Dedalus is basically James Joyce's alter ego, so much so that Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man can basically be considered an autobiography of James Joyce. But as I said, this book is very complicated, so I'm going to break it down as best as I possibly can, starting with the first major factor in Dedalus' life, and probably the biggest influence on Irish society at the time, and that is religion and the Catholic Church. So Stephen Dedalus grows up in County Kildare, and he attends a religious primary school. Stephen has a very naive and basic understanding of religion at this time. He's not really questioning it. As most kids are at this time period, they're not questioning what adults are telling them. And from this, he gets a very early fear of hell. The teachers at the school are clergymen, and they sort of control their students based on fear of living a sinful life and fear of going to hell. And this is pretty apparent in one of the earlier sections of this book, which I'll read right now. So before he goes to bed, Stephen says this. His fingers trembled as he undressed himself in the dormitory. He told his fingers to hurry up. He had to undress and then kneel and say his own prayers and be in bed before the gas was lowered so that he might not go to hell when he died. He rolled his stockings off and put on his nightshirt quickly and knelt trembling at his bedside and repeated his prayers quickly, fearing that the gas would go down. So this is a very weird passage because there's an obvious fear of him going to hell, but it's so naive in a way and so childish that you don't think much of it, or you shouldn't think much of it, but it shows that the teachings themselves that he's learning is not found in love of Catholicism or devotion to God. It's more of fear of going to hell. You can tell that he has a very one-dimensional perspective on what hell is, and that the slightest sin could cause him to go to hell. And you have to wonder at this time, like, what are these clergymen teaching him to live a life of such, like, insane fear and such clear distinctions between good and evil, and how quickly you can turn to evil and how quickly you can turn to evil just from not praying before the gas goes down. And, it could be quite scarring, I think, for someone of that age. Even though Stephen Dedalus at this time doesn't have a very challenging perspective of religion, the adults around him do. Between semesters, he goes back home to a Christmas dinner with some of his family and some other locals in the town, including a governess named Dante. And Stephen's father, during the start of the dinner, makes an offhand remark about the Catholic Church and its involvement in elections, in local elections. And I'll read the scene and you'll understand that this does not go over well at the table. "I'll pay your dues, Father, when you cease turning the house of God into a polling booth." "A nice answer," said Dante, "for any man calling himself a Catholic to give to his priest." "They have only themselves to blame," said Mr. Douglas suavely. "If they took a fool's advice, they would confine their attention to religion." "It is religion," Dante said. "They are doing their duty in warning the people." "We go to the house of God," Mr. Casey said, "in all humility to pray to our Maker and not to hear election addresses." "It is religion," Dante said again. "They are right. They must direct their flocks." "And preach politics from the altar, is it?" Mr. Douglas asked. "Certainly," said Dante. "It is a question of public morality. A priest would not be a priest if he did not tell his flock what is right and what is wrong." So here you get a very good glimpse of how tumultuous discussing religion is at this time. Stephen's father, Simon, makes an offhand remark about the political allegiances of priests at the time and how they could be swaying elections, and a more faithful follower of the Catholic Church, and Dante immediately calls him out for it and says that because they are priests, they have a better connection with God, and that they should be allowed to sway the flocks, as she calls them, into following the quote-unquote correct political ideologies. And it's funny that this is mentioned now because almost over 100 years later, from my experiences during the 2020 election, the priest from my local parish said that around November that if Joe Biden was to be elected president, he said that hell on earth could potentially be a possibility. So across borders and over a century later and things like that still have not changed very much. And later on, as Simon continues his sort of anti-religion rhetoric, one of his uncles, Uncle Charles, says, "Simon, Simon," said Uncle Charles, "the boy," which draws to mind the Simpsons meme of "think of the children." So there's this weird sort of idea that any sort of questioning towards religion is therefore bad for children, which is kind of interesting and kind of shows the sway and the influence that the Catholic Church has at this time, that you can't even teach kids at this point in their lives to question anything revolving the church because that could be considered blasphemous. And even Simon's remarks of pointing out how problematic it could be that priests are using religion to sway people into thinking certain political ideologies could be blasphemous as well, shows that there really isn't much room for free thinking in Ireland at this time. And early on in Stephen's life, you can tell that his political mindset and religious mindset is very much influenced by his father. He has this very cold... When he moves to Dublin as a younger man, he's still not old enough to be away from his parents, but he's probably in his early teens at this period. He has a very cold perspective on the world. He doesn't really follow religion very passionately. He knows of the consequences of going to hell by sinning, but it's not really dissuading him from doing what he wants to do. During this time, he refers to the world as being squalid. Dublin means very little to him. He sees very little in the world around him. He lusts after women. He masturbates. Not at the same time, to clarify, he's not committing sexual assault. And he also spends his free time away from his studies reading what he calls subversive writers. And at first, I didn't know what a subversive writer was until a couple pages later when that is made more clear. During a conversation with some of his friends, they start talking about who their favorite poets are. And at this point, I sort of start to understand what a subversive writer is, and that would be a writer who the Catholic Church considers blasphemous. And I will read the scene out so you can understand as well. "And who do you think is the greatest poet?" asked Bolin, nudging his neighbor. "Byron, of course," answered Stephen. Heron gave the lead, and all three joined in a scornful laugh. "What are you laughing at?" asked Stephen. "You," said Heron. "Byron, the greatest poet? He's only a poet for uneducated people." "He must be a fine poet," said Bolin. "You may keep your mouth shut," said Stephen, turning on him boldly. "All you know about poetry is what you wrote up on the slates in the yard and were going to be sent to the loft for. In any case, Byron was a heretic, and immoral too." "I don't care what he was," said Stephen hotly. "You don't care whether he was a heretic or not," said Nash. "What do you know about it?" shouted Stephen. You never read a line of anything in your life. I know that Byron is a bad man, said Bolin. Here, catch a hold of this heretic, Heron called out. In a moment, Stephen was a prisoner. So you can infer that through their teachings from Catholic churches that there is a correlation between people who do not follow Catholicism with people that are uneducated. Lord Byron is considered a poet for the uneducated people because he's a heretic himself. I do not know much about Byron himself. I read his poems before, but to classify him now, because he's such a beloved poet today, to classify him at that time as being uneducated is kind of crazy to me. And it seems to be due to the fact that solely because the Catholic Church considers his works to be blasphemous, when Stephen calls them out that they don't know anything about Byron, he's right. They don't know any of his poems. They don't know his writing style. They just classify him as being something not for them probably just because the Catholic Church told them to think that way. And the same goes for Victor Hugo later on in the book. To make the comparison more obvious, Joyce creates a scene where they're talking about Victor Hugo's work, and the priest they're discussing with said that he liked Hugo's work better when he was a follower of Christianity and didn't like his work after he broke away from the church. So, I mean, how more obvious could you get with that remark? There's also this weird merging of cold cosmic indifference with religion and morality itself in Stephen's mind at this time. There's an earlier passage in the book where he's writing his name, Stephen Douglas from this place in the earth, in the world, in the universe, but what comes after the universe, and he doesn't know. So earlier on, he's very interested with his place in this vast universe that is incalculable to understand. And then later on, this understanding becomes more morbid, as I read as followed. He could scarcely recognize his own thoughts, and repeated slowly to himself, I am Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork, in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in the Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon, Stephen, and Victoria. Names. The memory of his childhood suddenly grew dim. He tried to call forth some of its vivid moments, but could not. He recalled only names. Dante, Parnell, Clane, Clongos. And then later on in this passage he says, he had not died, but he had faded out like a film in the sun. He had been lost or had wandered out of existence, for he no longer existed. How strange to think of him passing out of existence in such a way, not by death, but by fading out in the sun, or by being lost and forgotten somewhere in the universe. So clearly, if you can't tell from this passage, he has very little regard for life in general, as he doesn't really understand time. He's having a very difficult time understanding his placement in this vast universe, while also not really understanding time itself. He knows he's alive, but also he feels dead at the same time. He's sort of experiencing time out of sorts, and it's really messing with his mind. He is clearly... I'm wondering if the source of this is his misery, or if it's sort of based on the fear of everything that he's been, drilled into since a young age. Fear of sinning, fear of going to hell, and all of that. And he seems to be the only character really having a problem coming to terms with his placement in the world and what he wants to do with his life. And that seems to be the genesis of his desire to eventually break out and become an artist. There's also this recognition that his human instincts goes against the teachings of the Catholic Church at the time. And I'm wondering if there's this weird recognition or subconscious recognition of the preposterousness of following a creed like that so passionately. He even says on page 117 of my book that devotion had gone by the board. What did it avail to pray when he knew his soul lusted after his own destruction? So it's his recognition that he's damned, that there's nothing he can do about it. Hell seems to be an obvious destination for him, a clear destination for him, or even if there even is a hell, and the universe is just vast and there's no meaning to life and he'll die, and like you said with the film, just burn out into nothing. So, and it causes him to act in a way that goes against what morality was. He, later on in this very passage, he goes to a prostitute and has sex, and it's sort of this weird comfort he gets from it. It's getting a very brief comfort and briefly forgetting about the apparent pointlessness of his own life. And that's one of the vices he goes to, apart from many other things. But this sort of nihilistic philosophy doesn't last very long. He goes to a retreat with his school, and what ensues is a approximately 20 long page rant or teaching, what have you, from a religious leader at this camp about how horrible and awful hell is. And you have to read it for yourself to really understand it. It's very gratuitous, and I think it serves the point of... And I understand the point of its gratuitousness, but it's very long, and I'm not going to attempt to read anything from it. Just know that the priest goes out of his way to scare these children into fearing hell, and it works like a charm on Stephen Dedalus temporarily. So after being scared practically to death, Stephen Dedalus changes his life around. The world no longer is cold and empty to him, which is a good thing. It's filled with meaning, but also at the same time, it's restricting him mentally and physically. And I'll go into examples of the two. Mentally, he's no longer questioning the world around him, as I'll read here. So entire and unquestionable was this sense of the divine meaning in all nature granted to his soul that he could scarcely understand why it was in any way necessary that he should continue to live. Yet, that was part of the divine purposes, and he dared not question its use. He, above all others who had sinned so deeply and so foully against the divine purpose. So at this point, he's renouncing his life of sin and is, as I said, basically crippling himself mentally to not think of any of the problems with his teachings and what he's learning. So he wonders in this passage, like, why, if heaven is such a nice place compared to a world that he's living in now filled with sin, why does he bother to live? But then he says, oh, well, this is just part of God's plan. Let's just not question it. So already there's a change in his mental exercise, in his mental thought process of, oh, well, this is God's plan. Just don't question it because I'm a sinner, so therefore I'm not allowed to question it. And there's also physical crippling as well, where he basically has to block out the world around him in order to live what he thinks is a sinless and morally pure life. In order to mortify the sense of sight, he made it his rule to walk in the street with downcast eyes, glancing neither to right nor left and never behind. His eyes shunned every encounter with the eyes of women. From time to time, he also balked them by a sudden effort of the will, as by lifting them suddenly in the middle of an unfinished sentence and closing the book. And then, so that's a sense of sight. And for a sense of smell, he writes, he found in the end that the only odor against which his sense of smell revolted was a certain stale, fishy stink like that of long-standing urine. And whenever it was possible, he subjected himself to his unpleasant odor. To mortify the taste, he practiced strict habits at table, observed to the letter all the fasts of the church, and sought by distraction to divert his mind from the savors of different foods. So his sight, he's literally forcing himself to look at the ground as he walks. And in addition to that, he's also forcing himself to fast and not enrich himself in different types of food. He's restricting himself in all different means just for the purpose of living what he thinks would be a pure life. But ultimately, even though he attempts to block off his senses from the rest of the world in order to live a pure life, it doesn't work. The temptation still persists, and it causes him to question again what it means to live a sinless life. And it very much parallels James Joyce's own views on Catholic teachings at the time. There is a podcast on Portrait of the Outer-Second Man by BBC Radio, and there's a quote that they read from Joyce on the Catholic Church's views on sex and sexuality, which I'll read right now. He refers to the sexual hypocrisy in Ireland and contemporary Victorian society as the lying drivel of pure men and pure women who love forever. So he's pointing out the hypocrisy of a pure lifestyle in general. Joyce himself, although he separated himself from the church as he got older, from being a very ardent follower to then separating himself as he moved out of Ireland, he still never completely rejected the Catholic Church. As I read this, I sense that the criticisms here are more directed at the teachers themselves and the lack of evolution that is going on in the teachings. They're preaching things that they are preaching things that were taught at this point over 1,000 years ago. And I think what Joyce is ultimately going for here is saying that these are outdated and need to change because, as you see with Stephen Dedalus, he literally has to cripple himself mentally and physically in order to attempt to live a sinless life. And even then, temptation still exists. But ultimately, I think that he does find some value in Catholic teaching, just that the obsession with sin is probably his biggest point of contention. But unfortunately for Douglas, the Catholic Church isn't the only conforming and highly influential ideology in Ireland at the time. So as I said, this is in the early 1900s for the most part, and Ireland at the time had already gone through several revolts and revolutions against Great Britain in order to secede from them, but ultimately none of them had worked up to this point. And with that, there are plenty of people in Ireland, especially in Dublin at the time, who are very passionate nationalists and very passionate for Irish independence, as seen in his friend Davin. And for a little historical background, Douglas is growing up in the wake of the death of Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a leader of the Irish Parliament Party in British Parliament and fought very passionately for Irish independence. But at one point, a sex scandal got revealed where he was having an affair with another person's wife, and it basically ruined him politically, and he died without any of the power that he'd once had during his peak in the Irish Parliament. But his presence is still everywhere in this novel and in people. He is, for Catholics, for ardent Catholic followers, they hate Parnell. For nationalists, they love Parnell. And ultimately, as you see at the dinner table scene, as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge divide there as well. So as I said, there's a character named Davin who is a passionate Irish nationalist. And as he talks to Stephen during his time at University College Dublin. So just for some context, he's at UCD at this point, and he's older. He's probably about 16 at this point. And Douglas himself is never particularly passionate about Irish nationalism as he was in the Catholic Church. He never at any point in this book is an ardent follower of Irish nationalism, but at this point, Davin is trying to convince him of this way. He wants Stephen to create an Irish name for himself. He wants Stephen to learn Gaelic, to, desire Irish independence and to fight with him. But Stephen kind of points out the pointlessness of it in this quote, which I'll read. "When you make the next rebellion with hurley sticks," said Stephen, "and want the indispensable informer, tell me. I can find you a few at this college." "I can't understand you," said Davin. "One time I hear you talk against English literature, and now you talk against the Irish informers. With your name and your ideas, are you Irish at all?" So here, Douglas is obviously criticizing the lack of military resources they have in order to form a successful rebellion in the first place. At this time, they'd already attempted several, none of which had really amounted to anything due to the fact that they had very limited resources and very limited support from the rest of the world. Davin then tries to play the historical card against him, saying that the British people came to their land and that and it's their responsibility to fight and take them out for their ancestors, to which Douglas responds with, "My ancestors threw off their language and took another," Stephen said. "They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject themselves. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life, in person, debts they made? What for?" So here, it's Stephen sort of rejecting the sins of his past Irish people. He feels no responsibility to the mistakes that people before him made, whereas Davin feels very much like he needs to stand up for the people in his past and for Ireland as a whole. I think the English language for him is just an evolution. As I said, with the lack of evolution in the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church teachings, he's seeing an evolution in Ireland, and he does not see the Gaelic language going the wayside as being a necessary thing worth fighting for. He wonders about the responsibility of the Irish people, especially at this time. He sees the fighting as being pointless as well, because ultimately they're not going to achieve any sort of military success against an empire like Great Britain at the time, whereas Davin, with his stubbornness, doesn't seem to understand that. Stephen tries again to point out to Davin the hypocrisy and pointlessness of factionalism in this regard, of identifying yourself as Ireland. And he says here, "The soul is born," he said vaguely, "first in those moments I told of you. It has a slow and dark birth, more mysterious than the birth of the body. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets." Davin knocked the ashes from his pipe. "Too deep for me, Stevie," he said, "but a man's country comes first. Ireland first, Stevie. You can be a poet or a mystic after." "Do you know what Ireland is?" asked Stephen, with cold violence. "Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow." So in this conversation, which happens later on in the book, it seems like the factionalism from Catholicism, from Irish nationalism as a whole, is just kind of boiling over Stephen's head. And Ireland, when he refers to Ireland, in this context, he's referring to the cultural and social aspects of Ireland at the time, with the Catholic Church, with Irish nationalism, with a responsibility for the people that came before you. And he's trying to get to Davin's head that as an artist, he wants to carve an own path for him and not follow the creeds of another philosophy or ideology before him. But ultimately, it doesn't actually work in influencing Davin anymore. And in response, Davin says that because he's Irish, he has a responsibility to Ireland, and that anything, including Stephen's love of art, should come second to defending Ireland, because that is what he is ultimately. But I want to focus more on what Stephen said about flying. I'll read the passage again, because it's very important. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. And that got me thinking, because there's a lot of flying imagery in Portrait of the Artist Man. So at this point, I'm going to go into what flying means for this. So in this portion, one of the more notable elements of Wing's imagery comes from after Stephen is confronted by a priest who asks him if he wants to join the priesthood as well. Stephen, at first, is pretty open-minded to it, but as he thinks of it more and more, he sort of turns away from it, because he realizes he's going to be joining the same conforming elements that he's been opposed to. So he goes out to the outskirts of Dublin by the docks, and he sort of has this epiphany of how he's going to break the mold of the Irish people and preventing himself from being caught in the tumultuous culture that is Ireland at the time, and that is by literally leaving Ireland. So from what I gather, wings and flight mentioning in this book in general equals freedom, equals escape, equals literally leaving Ireland, and is equivalent to achieving your own desires in life, and for Stephen, achieving his own artistic pursuits and understanding aestheticism. It's interesting that in that passage I'd read that he refers to Dublin as a net, literally keeping people in. And I like the physical imagery of that. It's like wings versus net. It's freedom versus restriction. And I don't think it's targeted. I think there is a definite love for Ireland in general, especially in descriptions of Dublin and of Howth, but his animosity is mostly directed at the people and the culture that has persisted through, years and years of violence and of conflict and of factionalism that has done nothing to help Stephen or other people in Ireland achieve anything of the artistic nature, or achieve much of the artistic nature, except for a select few group of people. When he's looking out at Howth and has his epiphany, he finds a woman in the water between Dublin and Howth, and this is the passage that reads: "A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender, bare legs were delicate as a crane's, and pure save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her thighs, fuller and soft-hued as ivory, were bared almost to the hips, where the white fringes of her drawers were like feathering of soft white down. Her slate-blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her." So here you have the bird imagery, the flying imagery, the sense of freedom that's hitting him, and also her description, especially in the colors of green and white, obviously parallel the Irish flag, which has the colors green and white in it, in case you didn't know. But this woman that he meets isn't necessarily real, I think, because he tries to go back to her, but she disappears. So it's a sort of maybe self-indulgent on James Joyce's part, epiphany that the person himself finds, that like it's literally some spirit is telling him and is helping him achieve the artistic desires that he wants. So take that with what you will. But it's interesting that he has to literally get outside of Dublin in order to have this epiphany. Going back to the whole net theory, in order to escape, in order to achieve what he wants, he has to get out of the net. He has to literally fly away. But the flying imagery goes beyond just what I mentioned before. There's also relevance to Greek myth, specifically the wings of Icarus and Daedalus. In case you didn't know, Daedalus, the name, is based off of a Greek an ancient Greek myth about Daedalus, who was a brilliant artificer, the great artificer. He was a great architect who helped King Menos design his labyrinth. But after he finished the labyrinth, King Menos threw him and his son Icarus into prison. But by defying his king, Daedalus created an escape plan in which he made wings for himself and for his son Icarus, warning Icarus in advance not to fly too close to the sun or he would die. So they escape, but Icarus, of course, flies too close to the sun and melts the wax on his feathers, and he falls into the ocean and dies. From there, Daedalus retreats to Sicily, whereas our Stephen Daedalus retreats to Trieste in Italy as well. So there's another parallel there for you. And ultimately, this comparison seems to be both Daedalus, the Greek character of mythology, and Stephen Daedalus are defying their country, defying their leaders, and going off to literally escape in order to, pursue their own artistic endeavors. In conclusion, the only way for Stephen Daedalus to achieve what he wants is by literally leaving Ireland to escape the ties and the pulls of Catholicism and Irish nationalism that surrounded him at the time. His friends and family tried to urge him not to go, but in order to achieve what he wants, he needs to leave. Despite all these teachings that are being hammered into his brain throughout his whole life, none of them stick. But his love for aestheticism, which is the art of studying beauty and what beauty really is what captivates him, which is something that he discovers on his own. Ultimately, the point of A Portrait of the Artist Young Man is for Stephen to find his self-actualization. And as someone who is an aspiring writer who is trying to get published himself, I found this book to be very relatable in many ways. I have been to Ireland, and I love to travel myself personally, and I can really relate to his desire to break away from the norm. And I think if you are like that as well, you will probably love this book. I think Portrait of the Artist Young Man is one of the best books I've read in recent memory. I can't wait to read it again because I'm sure there's a lot that I've missed, and I'm more and more excited to read more of James Joyce's works. So with that being said, my next edition of Road to Ulysses will be James Joyce's play, Exiles. His only play, actually. And it's only 150-ish pages, so if you want to read it, it's very short, no excuses here. Ultimately, I'm very excited to keep reading with James Joyce because I really, really love this book a lot. I love the style, and I think that as someone who has studied Irish culture and Irish history before, I think he does a very good job encapsulating how divisive this time period was for Ireland, and how it, compares to even countries in the real world today, including the U.S., and how very little things change, despite it being over a century years old. So yes, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm considering making another video on Portrait of the Artist Young Man, going into aestheticism and the definition of beauty and how Stephen Daedalus defines beauty, because I read that section and it was very confusing, and this video is already fucking long enough as it is, so I'm not going to add more to it. So I hope you like this video. If you have any recommendations for me in the future with the series, let me know. This is just a lot, and I understand that this is a work in progress, making this series and future series to come, but I hope that you found this video to be insightful, helpful if you tried to read it and didn't understand it, or hopefully encouraging if you want to read it now after hearing this review. I think the writing style specifically is the draw to this book. I think even though that I told you the plot, you'll still get as much enjoyment out of it as I probably did if you relate to it. I didn't know anything about the plot going into it, but I'm assuming you watched this video because you want to know more about my thoughts and my interpretation of it. So yes, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm very interested. As I said, Exiles is next. We'll be getting to that probably in the next few weeks or so. It's pretty short, so it shouldn't have much of a problem. And maybe I'll do another portrait video on aestheticism. So thank you so much for making it this far, if you made it this far, and goodbye.